2 words. That was all it cost her. 2 words breathed into the wrong corridor, aimed at the wrong man, at the worst possible moment, inside the most quietly lethal room in the entire city. 2 words that should have bought her a shallow grave, and a missing persons report that nobody would have followed up on. But Cyro Alphant did not reach for a weapon. He reached for her waist. The Carmine Hall did not look like the kind of place where people were erased. That was precisely the point. Dark wood paneling, white linen tables, chandelier light falling across the room like something out of an old oil painting. It was beautiful the way certain traps are beautiful, designed so carefully that by the time you realized what it was, you were already inside it. Somewhere near the back of the main hall, a string quartet played something European that nobody was actually listening to, because the men seated at those oval tables had not come for the music. They had come because the Carmine Hall was the one place in this city where 4 crime syndicates could sit in the same room without immediately trying to destroy each other. A neutral summit. Civilized on the surface. The way a grenade is civilized before the pin comes out. Mara Soretti had been given 3 instructions when she arrived for her shift at 6 that evening. Eyes down. Tray level. Do not, under any circumstances, speak to the guests at the inner hall tables unless spoken to first. She had nodded, tied her apron, and privately thought the rules were oddly specific for a waitressing job. She was a paralegal intern, not a cocktail waitress. But Nico's retrial window was 6 weeks away. The defense attorney who could actually win it needed $12,000 up front, and the Soretti family had run completely dry. So Mara kept her tray level, kept her eyes down, and moved through the gilded warmth of that hall like a woman who understood that invisibility was, tonight, her greatest asset. She was doing well at it. Right up until the corridor. She had slipped through the side door to collect a replacement ice bucket, 30 seconds away from the room, just 30 seconds, and the corridor was narrow, poorly lit, and already occupied. The man's name was Facchetti, though she did not know that yet. What she knew was that he was broad across the shoulders, that his eyes had the glazed, slow-focusing quality of someone 4 drinks past their limit, and that the way he moved to block her path was not careless. It was deliberate. "You've been walking past my table all evening," he said. Mara stepped back. The wall found her immediately. Stone at her shoulder blades, Facchetti filling the only other direction, and the ice bucket in her hands suddenly feeling very small and very useless. "Sir, I need to get back to the floor," she said. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that already knew the answer to a question she had not agreed to be asked. He reached out and touched the strap of her dress. Just 1 finger. Slow and completely certain of itself. And something animal moved through Mara's chest. Not quite fear, or not only fear, but the specific cold clarity of a person who has just understood, with the full weight of their body, that screaming will not help them here. Not in this corridor. Not in this building. Not tonight. Her eyes moved, sharp and desperate, down the length of the hallway. And at the far end of it, a door swung open. A man stepped through. He filled the frame the way certain men fill spaces, not with noise or movement, but with a kind of gravitational certainty, as though the room had quietly reorganized itself around his arrival without being asked. Dark suit, collar open at the throat. Salt and pepper at his temples, jaw set like something carved rather than grown. Tattoos running from his collar down to the backs of both hands, the ink settled and permanent, including a skull across his knuckles that caught the dim corridor light with the quiet confidence of a thing that had long since stopped needing to prove itself. His eyes came down the corridor in one clean sweep. They registered Mara. Then Facchetti. Then the finger on the strap of her dress. And before any reasonable, self-preserving part of Mara Soretti could weigh the consequences, before her paralegal brain could calculate the risk of what she was about to do inside a building full of men who resolved problems without filing paperwork. Her mouth made its own decision. There you are, baby. The words left her body, like a reflex she did not own. And the corridor went very, very still. Facetti's hand dropped. The certainty drained from his face, the way color drains from a person who has just stepped off a curb and heard the horn. He looked at Mara, then at the man at the far end of the corridor, and the recalculation behind his eyes was immediate and total. He took one step back, then another. Then he straightened his jacket with the exaggerated casualness of a man, pretending that none of the last 30 seconds had happened, turned, and walked away without a word. And Cyril Alphant, whose name sat in this city the way a scar sits on skin, permanent and explanatory, walked the remaining length of that corridor without hurrying, without any visible reaction on his face, and settled his arm around Mara's waist with a steadiness that felt almost rehearsed. She felt the weight of it. Solid. Unhurried. The arm of a man who had decided something. He did not look at her immediately. He watched the space where Facsetti had been, for just a moment longer than necessary, the way you watch a door after you have closed it to make sure it stays shut. Then he turned his face down toward hers, and his voice arrived low, measured, and close enough that it belonged only to her. "You're shaking," he said. "Stop. And smile at that empty corridor like you're glad to see it empty." Mara smiled. She did not know his name yet. She did not know that the arm around her waist belonged to the most feared capo in the city, or that every man seated at those inner hall tables had just clocked this moment from a distance. She did not know that she had just handed herself a problem that no amount of legal knowledge could easily unpick. What she did know in her chest, in her spine, in the very specific way her body had stopped shaking the moment his arms settled around her, was that whatever trap she had just built around herself, she was not the only one standing inside it. And only one of them looked afraid. "Stay with us, because in about 10 minutes, this woman is going to be standing in a near-empty car park at 1 a.m, reading a contract on the bonnet of a black car that she absolutely should not sign. And the thing about contracts, as any paralegal will tell you, is that the dangerous ones never feel dangerous when you are holding the pen." The summit ended at 11:45. Mara knew this because she had been counting the minutes from the moment Cyril steered her back through the side door, back onto the main floor, and back into the quiet performance of being someone she was not. For the remainder of that evening, she moved through the hall with her tray, refilled glasses she barely saw, and smiled at nothing in particular, while her paralegal brain worked in the background like a machine that had not been given permission to stop. She kept waiting for the arm to leave her waist. It always came back. Not aggressively, not with any show, just that same unhurried weight, settling against the small of her back whenever a pair of eyes from the inner tables drifted too long in her direction, and then lifting again the moment passed, as though Cyril Alphant was operating on a frequency she could not quite tune into. By the time the guests began to clear and the string quartet packed away their instruments, Mara had decided 2 things. The first was that she was going to walk out of the front entrance, collect her jacket from the staff room, and never return to this building for as long as she lived. The second was that the man who had not left her side for 4 hours was going to let her do that without complication. She was wrong about the second one. The car park behind the Carmine Hall was the kind of space that looked even less friendly at night than it did on paper. Low ceiling, sparse lighting, the kind of silence that does not feel like quiet so much as it feels like waiting. His car was a black saloon parked at the far end, facing the exit, which she suspected was not an accident. Cyril had said nothing to her on the walk out, and she had said nothing to him, and somehow the silence between them had the shape of a conversation that was already in progress. He opened the passenger door for her. She did not get in. "I'd prefer to stand," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then let the door swing shut, walked around to the bonnet, and set a folded document on it with the unhurried ease of a man who had done this sort of thing before. Not the Mafia part, specifically, but the part where he needed someone to agree to something. 4 weeks, he said. Mara looked at the document and did not touch it yet. "In public, you are with me," he continued, his voice carrying just far enough to reach her and no further. "You attend 3 functions, possibly 4, you are credible, and you do not ask questions that the answer to would only make you uncomfortable." "And in return," she asked. 12,000 paid to the attorney directly, he said. "Not to you, to him, on record, so it cannot be touched." Myra was quiet for a moment. She was a paralegal intern, which meant she knew exactly what the phrase "on record" was worth when the person saying it had spent the better part of their career operating in spaces where records had a way of bending, and she made a private note of that. "You said 4 sentences, she said. He tilted his head slightly. "Back in the hall," she said. "When you pulled me aside after Facchetti left, you said you would explain in 4 sentences. "I counted," he said. "That was 4. It was technically 3, but she let that go." She stepped forward and picked up the document. It was a single page, typed cleanly, with no letterhead and no firm name at the top, which told her more about the man who had drafted it than any letterhead would have. The language was plain, almost blandly so: duration, compensation, conduct expectations, a mutual non-disclosure clause that used the word discretion 4 times in 2 paragraphs, which in her professional experience meant that the person who wrote it was not entirely confident that plain language would hold. There was a line at the bottom for her signature. And underneath that line, in smaller text, a single sentence that read, "All obligations cease immediately upon breach of discretion by either party." She read it again. Not because she had missed anything the first time, but because she wanted him to see that she was the kind of person who read things twice. "The attorney," she said without looking up. "Vincent Calabrese." "Yes," said Cyril. "He's good," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I named the number I named." Mara looked up then, and for the first time since the corridor she allowed herself to look at him properly. Not the quick, cataloging glance of a woman assessing a threat, but the steadier look of a person trying to understand what they were actually dealing with. He looked back at her without filling the silence, which she found, against her better judgment, oddly reassuring. She was 26 years old. She had $740 in her current account. Her brother's retrial window was 6 weeks away. And the man standing across this bonnet from her was offering to hand Vincent Calabrese $12,000 before she finished her next shift. She thought about Nico. She picked up the pen. "If you breach discretion before I do," she said, "this clause applies to you as well." "It does," said Cyril. She signed. He folded the document, put it inside his jacket without reading it again, and said, "I'll have someone send you the details for Saturday." "What is Saturday?" she asked. "Dinner," he said, "with people who will be watching to see if you flinch." He walked to the driver's side, opened the door, and paused. "You didn't flinch tonight," he said, without looking back at her. "That was the reason I stopped in that corridor." He got in, and the car pulled out of the space with the quiet efficiency of something that had somewhere to be. Myra stood alone in the car park, holding nothing, already wondering if she had just done something brilliant or something she would spend the next 4 weeks trying to survive. Probably both, she thought. With the Sorettis, it was always both. The details for Saturday arrived on Friday morning. Not as a message, not as a phone call, but as a knock at the door of Mara's shared apartment at 743, delivered by a man in a gray jacket who handed her an envelope, said nothing, and was back in the stairwell before she had fully registered that he had been there at all. Inside the envelope was a key card, a printed address, and a handwritten note that contained exactly 1 sentence. "Your things should be moved by this evening." Her flatmate, Dana, leaned against the kitchen doorframe with a mug of tea and watched Mara read it. "Moving company?" Dana asked. "Something like that," said Mara. The address on the note was a corner building on Vila Street, sandwiched between a dry cleaner's that smelled faintly of steam and a pharmacy with a handwritten sign in the window that nobody had updated since approximately the previous decade. The flat was on the 3rd floor. It was clean, quietly furnished, and the kind of space that communicated function over comfort without being unpleasant about it. A sofa in gray fabric, a kitchen with no unnecessary items on the counter, one bedroom and windows that looked down onto the street from 2 angles. Mara set her bag on the sofa and stood in the middle of the room for a moment, turning slowly. Then she walked to the window, looked down at the dry cleaner's awning, looked up at the building opposite, and counted 3 camera angles in under 90 seconds. One at the entrance door below, one in the upper corner of the hallway she had just walked through, and one mounted above the window frame on the building directly across the street. Too precise to be a general security installation, angled too deliberately at this particular flat. She turned around. Cyril was standing in the doorway to the kitchen. She had not heard him arrive, which she suspected was also not an accident. 3 cameras that I can see, she said. I assume there are more that I cannot. He looked at her with an expression that gave very little away, which she was beginning to understand was simply his face. 2 more, he said, both internal. In the bedroom, she asked. No, he said, and his tone carried the particular flatness of a man who considered the question reasonable enough to answer directly. The bedroom and bathroom are your space. That is generous of you, she said, with just enough dryness that it landed without escalating. He set a folder on the kitchen counter and opened it. Sit down, he said. I'll go through the ground rules once. Mara sat. The rules were not, in themselves, unreasonable. She was not to discuss Nico, her legal work, or any detail of her personal circumstances with anyone she met through Cyril, not even the people who would appear over the coming weeks to be friendly. Especially those people, he clarified, without elaborating on why, though she filed the clarification carefully. Her phone would need to run a secondary SIM when she was at any function, which would route her calls through a number registered to a name she had not yet been given. She was to tell anyone who asked that they had met 8 months ago at a gallery opening in the Merchant Quarter. He had chosen a gallery she would have plausibly attended, which meant he had done some level of background reading on her before that car park, which she chose not to comment on yet. If she felt unsafe at any point, there was a code phrase. I think I left something in the car. Has anyone ever had to use that? She asked. Twice, he said. What happened to them? She asked. He closed the folder. They were fine, he said. That is what the phrase is for. She nodded and did not push it, though she noticed that he had answered the outcome without answering the circumstances, which was a lawyer's move dressed in a plain man's clothing, and she tucked that observation away with the others. He was colder than she had expected. Not hostile, there was no edge to him that felt personal, but there was a distance to the way he moved through that flat that made it clear he was not interested in warmth as a mode of operation. In the corridor at the Carmine Hall, with Facchetti retreating and his arms steady at her waist, she had read him as controlled. Here, without the circumstance to react to, he was simply remote. He checked the window locks, confirmed the emergency contact was saved in her secondary phone, and told her the dry cleaner's owner downstairs, a man named Petty, knew the arrangement and would not make conversation, but would notice if anything was wrong. Petty is the kind of man who notices things, Cyril said. So am I, said Mara. He looked at her then, with the same stillness he had used in the car park, the look of a man revising a number he had already estimated. I know, he said, and it did not sound entirely like a compliment, though it did not sound like a warning either. It sounded, she thought, like an acknowledgement. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair where he had laid it, which meant the meeting was over, and paused at the door. Dinner is at 8 tomorrow, he said. A car will come at 7:15. What should I wear? She asked. Something that says you chose it, he said, not something that says you were told to. Then he was gone, and the door closed behind him with a quiet click that somehow managed to feel louder than a slam. Mara sat in the gray fabric flat on Vila Street for a long moment, listening to the faint hiss of the dry cleaner's machinery below. and thought about the fact that a man who had known her for less than 24 hours had just, very accurately, identified the one thing she could not stand: being told what to do. She was going to have to watch that, she decided. Because apparently, so was he. The car came at 7:14. Mara noticed this because she had been watching the street from the window since 7, which she would not have admitted to anyone, and because 1 minute early felt, in the context of everything she had learned about Cyro Alphant in the past 48 hours, entirely deliberate. She picked up her bag, took one last look at herself in the hallway mirror, and made a decision about the earrings she was wearing that had nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with the fact that they were hers, bought with her own money, on a Tuesday afternoon that had nothing to do with any of this. Small anchors, she had decided, were still anchors. The restaurant sat on the east bend of the river, low-lit and unhurried, with the kind of reputation that does not advertise itself, because the people who need to know about it already do. Cyro was waiting at the entrance when she arrived. He looked at her once, the way he had looked at the closed door in the corridor at the Carmine Hall, just long enough to confirm something, and then turned toward the entrance without comment, which she had already begun to understand was as close to approval as his face was willing to travel. "Who is Renata Tessari?" Mara asked quietly as they walked in. He did not break stride. "The woman who will spend this entire evening deciding whether you are real," he said. "And if she decides I'm not?" Mara asked. "Then she tells her husband," he said, "and her husband tells everyone worth telling." "Helpful," said Mara. "Stay close," he said. "Don't perform." She almost said that she knew what she was doing, but she swallowed it, because the honest answer was that she knew what she was doing in a courtroom prep room, not in a riverside restaurant full of people who treated social interaction as a contact sport. Renata Tessari was already seated when they arrived at the table. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, elegant in the precise, considered way of a woman who had spent decades understanding that elegance was not decoration but armor, and she looked up at Mara with eyes that were warm on the surface and doing a great deal of work underneath. "Cyro," she said, and then her gaze moved, "and this must be her." "Mara," said Cyro, with his hand at the small of her back. "Mara," Renata repeated, as though she were filing it somewhere specific. "Sit, please, both of you." The table seated 6, and the other 4, 2 men and their respective partners, were polite in the careful way of people who had been briefed to be polite, which meant they asked reasonable questions and listened to the answers with the attentiveness of people who were not actually listening to the answers. Mara answered everything cleanly. 8 months ago, gallery opening, Merchant Quarter, the Aldari exhibition. She had looked the exhibition up on Wednesday evening, knew the centerpiece work, knew the artist's background, and had quietly prepared 3 natural-sounding opinions about it that she could deploy at different points in the conversation, so that it did not sound like a single rehearsed response. It was, she reflected privately, not entirely unlike preparing a witness. Renata watched her through all of it. Not rudely. The woman was far too seasoned for rudeness, but with a sustained, peripheral attention that Mara felt the way you feel a draft in a room without being able to identify which window it is coming from. At one point, during a pause in the table's conversation, Renata leaned slightly toward her and said, "You don't seem like his usual type." "He doesn't seem like mine either," said Mara pleasantly. We were both surprised. Renata smiled, and it reached her eyes this time, which felt like clearing a checkpoint Mara had not been given a map to. Somewhere between the main course and the dessert that nobody at the table actually ordered, Cyro said something to the man on his left, something low and brief about a shipping arrangement that Mara was not meant to have heard, and she processed it in exactly the way she had processed the non-disclosure clause in that car park contract. Quietly and entirely. She did not react. But Cyro, when he turned back, caught something in her expression that had not quite finished clearing, and for just a second, something shifted in his. He said nothing about it. But later, When the dinner wound down and the table broke apart in the gradual, unhurried way of people who had gotten what they came for, Syra walked her to the car and said, without preamble, "What did you hear?" "Nothing useful," she said. "That's not what I asked," he said. She looked at him evenly. "I heard a reference to a loading schedule," she said, "and a name I didn't recognize, and I have already decided that both of those things are well outside the terms of what I signed." He held her gaze for a moment. "You've been studying me," he said. "I study everything," she said. "It's a professional habit. I'm not planning to do anything with it." The car idled at the curb, patient and dark. "Renata believed you," he said finally. "I know," said Mara. "She told me before she left. She said I was grounding for you." Something moved across his expression that she could not fully name, not quite discomfort, not quite something warmer than that, but something in the narrow space between the two. "She said that before," he said quietly, "about other people." "Was she right before?" Mara asked. He opened the car door. "Get in," he said. "It's late." She got in. And as the car pulled away from the river and the restaurant lights shrunk in the wing mirror, Mara sat with the uncomfortable and inconvenient realization that the evening had not felt like a performance for the last hour and a half of it. She was not sure when that had happened. She was even less sure what to do about it. It happened on a Wednesday. Not at a dinner, not at a function, not in any of the prepared and surveilled spaces that had begun to feel, over the past 2 weeks, like the boundaries of a world Mara had quietly learned to navigate. It happened on the Aldori Bridge at 2:30 in the afternoon, in broad daylight, while she was walking back from her legitimate job at the Mercer legal firm, where she still worked 3 days a week, because the contract had said nothing about her stopping, and because Mara Soretti was not the kind of person who let one arrangement swallow the rest of her life whole. She had a security detail, though detail was a generous word for it. His name was Sandro. He was compact and watchful, and had the particular stillness of a man trained to look like he was doing nothing while doing a great deal. And for 2 weeks he had walked a comfortable 12 paces behind her on any route she took outside the flat. She had been told, by Syro, not to lose him. She had not been told what to do if someone else did it for her. There were 3 of them. Not large men, which was the part she reflected on afterwards. Not the heavy, obvious kind of presence that your body registers as a threat from a distance, but lean, unhurried men in ordinary jackets who moved into her path the way a current moves, gradually and then all at once. One stepped in front. One came from the left. And before she had completed the turn to look for Sandro, she already knew from the sound of it, one sharp, abbreviated scuffle behind her, brief enough to mean it was professional, that he was no longer 12 paces back. The man in front of her was almost apologetic about it. "Mr. Tessari would like a word," he said, which told her 2 things immediately: that Renata's husband had decided something, and that the something was not going to be a conversation. "I don't know a Mr. Tessari," she said. "You know his wife," the man said. "I had dinner with her," said Mara. "Once." "Then this won't take long," he said, and reached for her arm. She pulled back, not from training. She had no training, but from the same sharp, cold reflex that had moved her against a wall in a dim corridor 2 weeks ago, and opened her mouth to do the one thing she had left in her available options. She said the code phrase. Loudly. "I think I left something in the car." The man in front of her blinked. It was not, she knew, a magic solution. But it was loud enough and strange enough, and said with sufficient conviction that the man's hand paused on her arm for just a fraction of a second longer than it should have. And a fraction of a second, she had come to understand from watching Syro operate in rooms, was sometimes all the geometry you needed. He arrived in under 4 minutes. She knew because she had been counting, standing with her back against the bridge railing with the 2 men holding a careful distance. The third, Sandro's situation, presumably resolved somewhere behind her, and the river moving below with the complete indifference of water that had seen worse. The car came from the north end of the bridge, not the south, which meant he had anticipated the route before she had finished saying the phrase, which meant someone had been running a secondary watch that Sandro knew nothing about. She filed that away. The men looked at the car. Then they left. Not running, they were too professional for running, but with the brisk, purposeful walk of people who had just completed a risk assessment and arrived at a unanimous conclusion. Cyril got out. He looked at her with a sweep so fast and thorough it felt like a scan, confirming something she didn't fully have language for, and then he said, "Get in the car," in a voice that was very controlled and very quiet. She got in. For the first 4 minutes of the drive, neither of them said anything. Mara sat with her hands in her lap and her jaw set and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and the silence in that car had a texture to it, tight and loaded and aware of itself. Then Cyril said, "You're not hurt." "No," she said. "Sandro is fine," he said. "They used a sedative, not." "I know," she said. And then, because she was 26 years old and had been holding the shape of a composed person for 2 weeks straight, and because something about the matter-of-fact way he was running through the debrief made the whole absurdity of it land all at once. The bridge, the men, the code phrase, the river not caring. She cried. Not softly, not decoratively. She pressed her fingers against her eyes and cried with the particular, barely contained fury of a person who is not sad but absolutely livid. And the sound of it was tight and short and unmistakable. Cyril said nothing for a moment. "You're angry," he said. "Of course I'm angry," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, which somehow made her angrier. "They put their hands on me on a public bridge in the afternoon because your arrangement made me a useful inconvenience to someone, and Sandro is unconscious in a stairwell somewhere, and I am sitting in this car having feelings about it, and I signed up to attend dinners." The car moved through traffic. "You said the phrase," he said. "I did," she said. "That was the right call," he said. "I know it was the right call," she said. "I would like some acknowledgement that it should not have been necessary." A pause settled between them. "You're right," he said. She looked at him. It was the first time, in 2 weeks, that he had said those 2 words about anything. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, straightened in the seat, and looked back at the road. "Tessari's husband is a problem," she said. "He was already a problem," said Cyril. "He's just become a louder one." "What does that mean for the arrangement?" she asked. He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him. "It means," he said carefully, "that 4 weeks may no longer be the number we are working with." Mara looked at him for one long moment. Then she turned back to the window. She did not say anything else for the rest of the drive, because there was nothing left to say that the silence wasn't already saying for her. She was told to stay in the flat. Not asked, told, by Cyril, in the car outside Vila Street, in the same measured tone he used for everything, as though the register of his voice had been set at a fixed point years ago, and he had simply never found a reason to adjust it. "For how long?" she had asked. "Until I say otherwise," he had said. She had gone inside without argument, which had surprised them both, she suspected. That had been Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, Mara Soretti had reorganized the kitchen cupboards, read the same paragraph of the same case brief 4 times without retaining a single word of it, watched the dry cleaner's awning below flutter in the same patch of wind for approximately 40 minutes, and arrived at the firm and honest conclusion that confinement, even comfortable confinement, was going to make her lose her mind. She needed something to do with her hands. More specifically, she needed something to do with her brain, because her brain, when left without material, had a long-established habit of turning inward and finding things to worry about, and there was currently no shortage of available material in that department. She opened her laptop. She told herself she was not snooping. This was, in the technical sense, partially true. 2 days earlier, the man in the gray jacket, the same one who had delivered her keycard on the first morning, had dropped a second envelope through the door containing a USB drive and a handwritten note that said, background documents. For your understanding of the environment. Do not print. It had come from Cyro. She assumed, though the note was unsigned, which was entirely consistent with a man who treated plausible deniability as a lifestyle choice. She had left the drive on the counter for 36 hours. Then she plugged it in. The drive contained corporate filings, shell companies, 14 of them, registered across 4 jurisdictions, with directorship names that changed in rotation every 18 months and registered addresses that pointed to postal forwarding services in cities that had nothing else connecting them. It was, from a legal architecture standpoint, a reasonably clean construction. Not elegant, elegance required consistency, but functional and clearly maintained by someone who understood company law well enough to stay inside the lines without ever committing to any one structure long enough to be examined. Mara read through the first 4 filings with the detached appreciation of someone reviewing someone else's work, and then she reached the 5th one and stopped. The 5th company was registered in the same jurisdictional cluster as the others, with a similar rotation of directors and a similarly unmemorable registered address. But the filing date was wrong. Not wrong in any dramatic, obvious sense, not the kind of wrong that flags itself in waves, but wrong in the quiet, procedural way that only becomes visible when you have read enough legitimate filings to understand what the rhythm of legitimate filing actually looks like. The annual confirmation for this particular company had been submitted 11 days earlier than the statutory window allowed. 11 days. Which meant either the filing agent had made an administrative error, or someone with advance knowledge of the confirmation deadline had submitted on behalf of a directorship that, officially, should not have known the deadline was coming. Mara sat back. She pulled the directorship list up again and went through the rotation. The named director at the time of the early filing was a man called R. Fontani, which she cross-referenced against the other company's directorship records, because that was the kind of thing her brain did automatically after 3 years of document review, and R. Fontani appeared exactly once across all 14 companies. One appearance, in one filing, submitted 11 days early. She got up, made herself a coffee she did not particularly want, stood at the kitchen counter, and thought about it. In her professional experience, limited, yes, but earnest, an anomaly like this meant one of 3 things. Clerical error, which was possible but unlikely given the otherwise careful construction of everything around it. A new and inexperienced filing agent who had not been briefed on the window, which pointed to someone recently introduced to the operation. Or someone inside the operation who had passed the confirmation deadline to a person on the outside before that person was supposed to have it. She sat back down. She typed the name R. Fontani into the search field of the company registry database she still had access to through the Mercer firm's legal portal, which she was using within the terms of her employment contract. She reminded herself, even if the application was somewhat adjacent to her current professional remit. 3 results. 2 were unrelated: a tradesman's sole trader registration and a historical property lease. And the 3rd was a directorship appointment to a logistics company registered 8 months ago, whose registered address was a building on the south side of the city that she recognized, because she had walked past it twice in the last fortnight. It was in the Tessari Quarter. Mara set down her coffee cup with a steadiness that cost her slightly more effort than it should have. She had not been looking for a mole. She had been looking for something to do on a Friday afternoon, because a man with salt and pepper hair had told her to stay inside, and her response to being told to stay inside was, apparently, to accidentally dismantle someone's corporate cover. She closed the laptop, picked up her phone, and sent a single message to the number Cyro had given her for non-emergency contact. It said, "I found something in the background documents. It's not urgent, but it's not nothing. Call when you can." His reply came in under 3 minutes. "I'll be there in 20. She looked at the message for a moment. Then she opened the laptop again, because she wanted to be completely certain before he arrived. And because the one thing worse than bringing Cyril Alphant a problem, she had decided, was bringing him a problem she had not already half solved. Cyril arrived at the flat that Friday evening at exactly 20 minutes, as promised. He had sat across from her at the kitchen table, looked at what she had pulled from the filings without touching the laptop, asked her 2 precise questions about the Fontani directorship and the early submission window, and then been quiet for long enough that the dry cleaner's machinery below filled the silence on his behalf. "You found this by accident," he said finally. "I found it because I was bored and you told me to stay inside," she said. Something moved briefly across his face that was not quite amusement, but was related to it. He took a photograph of her screen, closed the laptop himself, and told her the Belmont auction was in 6 days and that she would need to be available. He did not say thank you, but he also did not leave immediately, and he made them both coffee without being asked, and Mara had decided privately that for Cyril Alphant those 2 things were probably the same gesture. Cyril had said it was a charity gala. This was true in the same way that the Carmine Hall was true when it described itself as a restaurant, accurate on the surface, and not designed to withstand any serious examination below it. The Belmont auction raised money for a children's literacy foundation, had a guest list that included 2 sitting city councilors and a regional senator, served champagne at $300 a glass, and was, according to the quiet briefing Cyril had delivered to Mara on the drive over, also the scheduled cover for a handoff that had been 18 months in the arranging. "What kind of handoff?" she had asked. "The kind you don't need the specifics of," he had said. She had let that sit, because she was becoming, with practice, reasonably fluent in the language of which questions Cyril would answer, and which ones he would simply wait out. His people had come to the flat at 4. 2 women, professional and unhurried, who arrived with a garment rail and a small case of accessories, and treated the process with the focused efficiency of people who understood that what they were dressing was not just a body, but a story that needed to hold up under close reading. The dress was deep burgundy, structured at the shoulder, and simple enough that it did not announce itself. "He picked this?" Mara asked. The taller of the 2 women glanced up. "He said to pick something that didn't try too hard," she said. "Of course he did," said Mara. She wore her own earrings. Nobody said anything about it. The Belmont was held in a converted civic building with high ceilings and the kind of donor plaques on the walls that told you more about the city's financial architecture than any filing ever could. Cyril met her at the entrance for the 2nd time in 3 weeks, and for the 2nd time she registered the brief, assessing look he gave her before his expression settled back into its customary neutral. "Senator Draven is already inside," he said. "What do I need to know about him?" she asked. "He believes he is the most important person in any room he enters," said Cyril. "Agree with him on everything except the things that matter, and he'll love you for it." "That is genuinely useful advice," said Mara. "I have my moments," he said, and it was said so flatly that it took her a half-second to confirm it was, in fact, a joke, which was the first one she had heard from him in 3 weeks and therefore felt disproportionately like an event. Senator Draven was precisely as described. He was tall in the way of men who had been told they were tall so many times that it had become structural, with a handshake that lasted slightly too long and a habit of addressing Cyril while looking at Mara, which was either a power move or a nervous one, she decided, and landed on power after the first 90 seconds. "And where did Cyril find you?" he asked, with the warmth of a man who had practiced warmth until it sat naturally on his face. "She found me," said Cyril quietly, and the senator laughed as though it was a performance and not, Mara thought privately, the most accurate description of what had actually happened. She talked to Draven for 11 minutes. She asked him 3 questions about the Literacy Foundation, each one slightly more specific than the last, and watched him move from polished to genuinely engaged by the 3rd, which was the intended effect, and which Cyril clocked from 2 feet away without appearing to be watching. When the senator was drawn off by a counselor with a checkbook and an agenda, Cyril touched the small of her back briefly. "Well done," he said. "Don't sound surprised," she said. "I'm not," he said. "I'm confirming." The cloakroom was on the east wing, past the auction display and a corridor of donor portraits, and Mara had been in it for under a minute when Renata Tessari came through the door. Not by accident. Renata closed the door behind her with the deliberate quiet of a woman who had engineered the moment, smoothed her jacket, and looked at Mara with the same warm, working eyes from the riverside dinner. "You're still here," said Renata. "It hasn't been that long," said Mara. "Long enough," said Renata. "After the bridge, most women would have taken the money and found a reason to leave." Mara kept her expression easy. "I don't know what bridge you mean," she said. Renata smiled, and it was the sharpest version of the smile she owned. "My husband made a poor decision," she said. "I want you to know that it was not sanctioned by me." "I don't have any feelings about your husband," said Mara, evenly. "No," said Renata, looking at her carefully. "I don't think you do." She paused. "What I'm trying to understand is what you do have feelings about." "The Literacy Foundation," said Mara. "The champagne is exceptional." Renata laughed, a real one, short and unguarded. "He doesn't let people in," she said. "Not since," she stopped and resettled. "He's careful." "I know," said Mara. "Are you?" Renata asked. The question sat between them with genuine weight. Mara held her gaze for a long, considered moment, with the same steadiness she used when a senior partner was waiting for an answer she could not afford to get wrong. "Yes," she said, "very." Renata studied her for one moment longer, then nodded once and opened the door. "Good," she said. "You'll need to be." Then she was gone, and Mara stood alone among the coats and the dim lighting and the distant sound of the auction beginning in the main hall, and let out a breath that she had been holding, she realized, since the door had closed. She straightened her dress. She walked back out. Cyril was exactly where she had left him, talking to two men she didn't recognize, and he glanced up when she reappeared with the same swift, confirming look she had come to recognize as his version of concern. She gave him the smallest nod. He turned back to the men. And Mara picked a glass of champagne from a passing tray and thought about what Renata had stopped herself from saying, and the shape of the sentence that had been sitting in the gap where she had stopped. Not since. Not since what she thought. Or not since who. The name R. Fontani, it turned out, was a middle name and a maternal surname, belonging to a man whose full legal name was Emilio Dante Fontani Greco, and who had worked as Cyro's internal accounts coordinator for the better part of 6 years, and who was, by all existing accounts, one of the quietest and most unremarkable people in the entire operation. Mara learned this on the Monday after the Belmont. When Cyro arrived at the flat at 8 in the morning, set a thin file on the kitchen table, and told her that the lockdown the bridge incident had triggered, the quiet, internal audit of movement, access, and communication across the syndicate's structure, had followed the thread she pulled from the filings and arrived 6 days later at a door. Emilio's door. "He's been with you 6 years, she said, reading the file. "Yes," said Cyro. "That's a long time to be afraid of something," she said. Cyro looked at her. "We don't know yet that it's fear," he said. "I think you do," she said quietly and turned the page. They brought Emilio in that afternoon. Mara was not supposed to be present for it, and she was not exactly, but the flat on Vila Street shared a floor with a room that Cyro used, occasionally, for conversations that required privacy and a door with a decent lock. And sound, in old buildings, travels along its own logic. She did not press her ear to anything. She simply did not leave the kitchen. Emilio's voice, when it came through the wall, was not the voice of a man running a calculated betrayal. It was the voice of a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had just been given permission to set it down. The Tessari people had come to him 14 months ago, he said, not with money but with information about his younger brother, who had made a serious and well-documented mistake in a city 3 hours south. The kind of mistake that carried a mandatory sentence, and who would continue to be protected from that documentation for as long as Emilio provided what was asked of him. Confirmation windows, he said through the wall, his voice thinning at the edges. Filing schedules. Nothing operational, he said, as though that distinction still carried weight from inside the room where he was sitting. Nothing that would get anyone killed. Mara sat very still at the kitchen table and thought about Nico's retrial window and the $12,000 and the specific texture of a decision made under a particular kind of pressure, and said nothing to anyone. Cyro's response, when it came, took less than 2 minutes. She heard it not as a raised voice. There was no raised voice, but as a silence that followed Emilio's last sentence and stretched long enough to have its own shape, and then Cyro's voice, lower than usual and completely level, saying 4 things. That Emilio would be moved, tonight, to a location the Tessari network had no knowledge of. That his brother's situation would be handled through channels that did not require Emilio to carry it anymore. That the filing access would be revoked quietly, in a way that would not signal to the Tessari side that the thread had been pulled. And that Emilio was not to contact anyone, not family, not old colleagues, not the brother, for 30 days, after which a conversation about what came next would be possible. Then the door opened, and she heard footsteps, and then a second set of footsteps that were slower and carried the particular cadence of a man who had just had a weight removed from him and was not yet sure how to walk without it. The front door closed, and then Cyro came into the kitchen. He looked tired. Not physically, she had never seen him look physically tired, but in the way that people look when they have just done something that costs them something that does not show on the outside. He sat down across from her, and for a moment he did not speak, and she did not fill the silence, because she had learned by now that his silences were not invitations and were not gaps. They were the actual thing he was doing. "You knew it was fear," he said eventually. "I recognized the math of it," she said. "Someone you love in a bad position, a narrow window, and a decision that feels temporary when you make it." He looked at her steadily. "You weren't just talking about Emilio," he said. "No," she said, "I wasn't." He nodded once and looked at the table, and the room held that for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't remove him from the operation." "I know," said Mara. "I heard." "Most people in my position would have," he said, not defensively, but in the way of a man making a factual observation about his own world. "I know that too," she said. And she did know it. She knew it the way she had come to know a number of things about him over the past 3 weeks, not through anything he had told her directly, but through the accumulating evidence of how he moved through decisions, the gap between what his world expected of him and what he actually did inside it, the coffee he had made without being asked, the coat door he had closed without drawing attention to it. She knew it, and she sat with it, and she watched him rub the back of his neck with one hand in the only gesture she had ever seen him make that was entirely unguarded. And the thing she had been carefully not nomming for the better part of 2 weeks walked into the room, sat down, and refused to leave. She was in love with him. Not the falling kind, not the dizzy, sudden kind that announces itself loudly and asks for a response. The other kind. The kind that arrives quietly, through a side door, and is already fully seated by the time you turn around and find it there. She looked at the table. She said nothing about it. But something in the quality of her silence must have changed, because Cyro looked up and looked at her, and did not look away immediately, and the kitchen on Vila Street held the two of them in it like a room that was aware of what had just shifted inside it. "You should eat something," he said finally. "You should too," she said. He got up and opened the refrigerator, and neither of them said anything else, and it was, Mara thought, the most honest conversation they had ever had. He stayed. That was the first unexpected thing. Not that he had eaten the food she put in front of him, not that the conversation had gone quiet in the way of people who were no longer performing silence at each other, But that when the hour grew late and the dry cleaner's machinery below had finally gone still, Cyril Alphant did not pick up his jacket and leave. He stayed, and she did not ask why, because asking would have made it a question that required an answer, and she was not certain either of them was ready for the answer. They moved to the sofa, the way people move toward warmth without deciding to gradually, and then simply there. Mara had her case notes open on her lap, not because she was reading them, but because they gave her hands something to hold, and Cyril sat at the other end of the sofa with the particular stillness of a man who had run out of things that needed doing and had not yet decided what to replace them with. The lamp in the corner gave the room a low, amber quality that had nothing to do with surveillance and nothing to do with strategy, which made it feel, she thought, like a different room entirely. She stopped herself, Myra said eventually. Renata, at the Belmont. Cyril looked at her. She said, not since, and then she stopped, Mara said. I've been sitting with it since Thursday. He was quiet for long enough that she almost let it go. Her name was Sophia, he said. She died 4 years ago. Mara did not say she was sorry, because he had not said it like a man looking for condolence. He had said it the way you state a coordinate, giving her a location so she could orient herself properly. She was inside the life, Mara asked. She grew up in it, he said. She understood the geometry of it better than I did sometimes. He paused. It didn't protect her. The lamp held the room. Is that why the distance? Mara asked. The rules, the cameras, the folded contract on the bonnet of a car. He looked at her with the steady, unreadable quality she had spent 6 weeks learning to read. Partly, he said. And the other part, she asked. The other part, he said, is that you walked into a corridor to collect an ice bucket, and 12 minutes later you had changed the entire geometry of my evening, and I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I dealt with it. She set the case notes on the cushion beside her. And now, she said. And now, he said, I understand what I'm dealing with, and it hasn't made it simpler. Outside, a car passed on Vila Street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling and then gone, and in the silence that followed she could feel the distance between them on the sofa as a specific, measurable thing, not large, and growing less so by the second. The 4 weeks are almost up, she said. I know, he said. That's not what I'm asking about, she said. I know that too, he said. He turned to look at her fully then, not with the assessing sweep she had catalogued across 6 weeks of functions and car rides and kitchen tables, but with something quieter than that, the look of a man who had stopped assessing and simply arrived somewhere. She met it, and the distance closed the way it had been closing for weeks, not all at once, but in the accumulated weight of every corridor and every code phrase and every silence that had meant more than the words surrounding it, until there was no distance left, and his hand was at her jaw and her hand was at his wrist, and neither of them had decided to do it because it had already been decided. Somewhere around a car park on a Tuesday night when she had picked up a pen, and he had folded a document into his jacket without reading it again. He kissed her with the same quality he had for everything, unhurried and deliberate and completely certain of itself. She kissed him back with the quality she had for everything, precise and clear-eyed, and more feeling in it than she had intended to show, and she showed it anyway. When they broke, his forehead came down to hers, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and the room was very still. This isn't in the contract, he said quietly. No, she said, it isn't. Mara. His voice carried something she had not heard in it before, not the controlled register of a man briefing her, not the flat economy of a man giving instructions, but the voice underneath all of that, lower and less defended. I know what I'm walking into, she said before he could finish. I'm a paralegal. I read the small print. Something shifted in his face, the particular shift of a man who has been carrying a tension for a long time and has just been told he can set it down. He tucked a strand of her hair back slowly, and she let him. The contract ends Friday, he said. Then we'll need a different arrangement, she said. He looked at her, And for the first time in 6 weeks, the expression on his face was entirely legible. Not managed, not neutral, not the closed door she had spent weeks learning to knock on. He looked, she thought, like a man who had stopped pretending the room wasn't warm. "Yes," he said simply, "we will." Outside, the city moved through its own indifferent dark, and inside the flat on Vila Street, nothing was the same as it had been that morning, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so, because some things do not need to be said to be completely, irrevocably true. The call came on a Thursday. Vincent Calabrese's assistant, precise and unhurried, informing Mara that the retrial had concluded the previous afternoon, that the procedural grounds had held, and that Nico Soretti had walked out of the Mercer County facility at 4:30 with his belongings in a paper bag, and their mother on the pavement outside. Mara took the call standing at the kitchen window, looking down at the dry cleaner's awning, and said thank you in a voice that came out steadier than she had any right to expect. And then she stood there for a long time after the call ended, holding the phone against her sternum, and let herself feel the full, uncomplicated weight of it. Nico was out. It was done. Which meant, with the clean, unsparing logic she had been carefully not applying for the past week, that everything else was done too. Cyril arrived at 6, as he had most evenings since the wall had come down, with the quiet ease of a man who had stopped pretending he needed a reason to be somewhere. She told him about the call before he had taken off his jacket. He looked at her for a moment, and the thing in his face was not complicated. It was simply glad, and he did not perform it or qualify it, and she loved him for that with the same quiet, seated certainty she had been carrying since the kitchen on Monday. He reached into his jacket. The contract had lived there, she assumed, since the car park, folded, unread after she signed it, carried with the same unhurried certainty as everything else he did. He set it on the table between them. Then he took it in both hands and tore it in half, cleanly, without ceremony, the way you close a file that no longer has anything useful in it. He set the two halves on the table and did not say anything. Mara looked at them. She had known this moment was coming for a week, had turned it over in her mind on the sofa and in the hours before sleep, had examined it from the angles available to a woman who read small print for a living and knew that endings written into contracts do not become less real because you would prefer them to be. "Thank you," she said, "for Nico, for the attorney, for all of it." "You earned it," he said. "That's not the same as thank you," she said. "No," he said, "it isn't." He paused. "Thank you, Mara." She nodded once and picked up her bag from the chair where it had lived for 4 weeks, and she walked to the door, because she was 26 years old and she had spent the last month learning, among other things, that the most dangerous thing she could do was stay somewhere because it had become warm enough to be afraid of leaving. She walked out. The stairwell was the same as it had always been, dim, with the faint hiss of the dry cleaners rising from below. And she went down it with her shoulders straight and her jaw set, and the specific, hollow clarity of a person doing something correct that does not feel correct at all. She passed Petty's shop without looking in. She walked through the early evening air of Vila Street, past the pharmacy with the outdated sign, and turned onto the main road and kept walking. 1 block. 2 blocks. Somewhere in the middle of the 3rd block, she stopped. Not dramatically. There was no moment, no cinematic pause, no realization delivered in a single clean beat. She simply stopped walking, because her body had apparently completed its own quiet audit of the situation and arrived at a conclusion her pride had been slow to ratify. She was not walking toward anything. She was walking away from the only person in the last 4 weeks who had looked at her with complete attention and not once asked her to be smaller than she was. The car pulled up to the curb beside her with the quiet efficiency she had come to recognize before she heard it, and the window came down, and Cyril looked at her from the driver's seat with the same steady, unreadable expression she had spent 6 weeks learning to read, and which she could read now, clearly, because it was neither unreadable nor neutral, and it had not been for some time. "The deal's done," he said. "I know," she said. "This isn't a deal," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, standing on the pavement in the early evening with her bag over her shoulder and 3 blocks of correct behavior behind her. And she thought about contracts and corridors and ice buckets and a code phrase said loudly on a public bridge, and the way a room feels when the person who has been filling it has not yet left. "No," she said, "it isn't." She opened the door and got in, and the city moved past the windows in its usual indifferent way, and neither of them said anything further, because there was nothing further to say that the last 9 chapters hadn't already said in full. His hand found hers on the seat between them. Not reaching, simply arriving, the way he arrived at everything, with the unhurried certainty of a man who had stopped pretending he didn't know where he was going. She turned her hand over and let it be held. And the car moved on through the dark, and Vila Street fell away behind them, and somewhere in a facility 3 hours south, Nico Soretti was sleeping in a room with an unlocked door, and the Soretti women, Mara had always privately believed, paid their debts in full. She had paid this one with considerably more than she had signed for. She found, sitting in that car with the city unwinding around her, that she did not mind at all.